Hey my nerds! So last time we covered the topic of how mental health can be used in the development of magic systems, and this time we're doing a world building special on the subject, which includes all sorts of ways you can incorporate mental health into the societies that you're creating. Enjoy! Now there are some fascinating ways that mental health has been used in world building over the years. My personal favourite is the existence of Spren in Way of Kings, which are elements of the cognitive realm that have been leaking into the physical world. They aren't limited to mental health, but they do include it, including gloom spren and depression spren, among others. Their existence makes mental health a concept that people are more aware of than they have been in our world for the majority of history, which is a nice touch. So, if you're looking to world build a fascinating mental health world of your very own, how do you go about it? Firstly, you'll need to consider how mental health manifests itself in your world. If you're changing the concept of mental health, like by making mental health scars physical, like I did in the short story Reliquary of the Damned, then this will naturally come with a whole host of world-building implications for you. The first world-building questions you'll have to ask yourself are, what are the attitudes toward mental health in your world? And what have they been in the society over the years? You can see from Western civilization how attitudes towards mental health have been changing over the last few hundred years, progressively becoming a less taboo subject. If you have a society that doesn't care about mental health issues, then you're going to see this manifest in different ways. And a great way to personalize your world building is to think about how the attitudes of your culture would manifest when it comes to those taboos. One example is how mental health in women was considered over the years. Hysteria, which by the way comes from the ancient Greek word for uterus, is a great example of this. Hysteria was a bit of a catch-all term for women acting emotionally in ways that weren't considered the norm, and it has reportedly included the misdiagnosis of both real mental and physical health conditions, which probably wouldn't have happened if men and women had been considered in the same light over the years. Another great example is how people with shell shock from the First World War were considered by society. At the time, it wasn't believed that a psychological trauma could cause illness, only that physical trauma could. This changed with the overwhelming number of shell shock cases seen during the First World War, eventually changing the way that the medical community and society at large considered mental health altogether. But until then, a lot of men were living with an illness that nobody could explain or understand, resulting in society as a whole trying to pretend shell shock away. So think about biases in your society. Racial, gender, sexual. Consider how the attitudes towards mental health would be considered, or more sadly, dismissed accordingly. You can go beyond this too by incorporating how attitudes in your world to certain behaviours will affect your world building with regards to mental health. A great example of how this manifested in our worlds comes from Freud's obsession with all things sexual, which in turn comes from a society oppressing the sexual. Wanting too much or too little sex were at the same time considered the basis of all mental health conditions according to Freud. And it was only really the impact of the First World War and the many cases of shell shock, which couldn't be linked to sex in any way, that changed this. So have a think about how various attitudes in your society could impact the way your society thinks about different mental health diseases, just like you would do for physical health conditions. Next up, the treatment of mental health conditions. How you do this entirely depends on how you have previously answered those other questions I've posed. If there is no acceptance of mental health in your world, then the treatments will be very different from a society that has accepted and conducted research into the understanding of mental health conditions. Linked to this is how mental health conditions are diagnosed and how they are prevented in your world, which are again linked heavily to the attitudes of society. Those are the questions you should be asking yourself as a bare minimum if you're exploring this topic. But there are some next level questions that I have for those of you who are the down the rabbit hole type of world builders. First up, what are the official terms used in your world to describe mental health as a whole, specific mental health conditions, including those you've created exclusively for your world, and do you have slang terms or even potentially different terms used by different regions or classes of society? Have you considered the legal ramifications of mental illness in your world? Do people with mental health conditions have their rights taken away from them? How does your civilization's political power consider individuals with mental health conditions? Is there a healthcare service available in your world? If so, does it cover mental health conditions? Who pays for treatment? Are treatments limited to those who can pay? And if so, how does this affect the type of treatments that are available? Also to be considered are the cultural differences when it comes to mental health. There are some cultures around the world where people in those cultures have a tendency to develop certain mental health diseases that can't be found anywhere else in the world. If you have multiple cultures in your world, then it could be interesting for you to vary how mental health manifests itself in those cultures and all of the implications thereof. Well, there you have it. That's it for this week's video. I mentioned last time about the Kickstarter for the short story anthology Alchemy of Sorrows, which is a fascinating collection of fantasy tales about grief, mental health, and healing. I've linked to the Kickstarter below, so if you're interested, please do check it out. Alright, my nerds, like and subscribe and all that jazz, and happy writing to you all. Hope you have a fantastic week. Bye!